I want to tell you something that I have never said out loud in quite this way before. For a significant portion of my adult life, I genuinely believed that I was too broken to be loved properly. Not in the dramatic, performative way that people sometimes say that about themselves when they want reassurance. In the quiet, private, deeply convinced way that lives below the surface of how you present yourself to the world and shapes every decision you make about what you are allowed to want. I believed it the way you believe things that have been confirmed enough times by enough different sources that questioning them starts to feel like the irrational position. My family said it in the language of concern. You are too sensitive. You feel things too deeply. You need to toughen up or the world is going to eat you alive. My first serious relationship said it in the language of frustration. You are exhausting. You make everything complicated. I cannot keep up with the way your mind works. A friend I trusted said it in the language of honesty. I just think you have a lot going on emotionally, and not everyone is going to be equipped for that. Each of these things was said by someone who believed they were telling me a truth I needed to hear. Each of them landed in a place inside me that was already tender and added another layer to a story I was quietly building about myself. The story was this: there is something fundamentally difficult about who you are, something that makes you harder to love than other people, something that means the ordinary things other people have, stable relationships, genuine belonging, the experience of being chosen and stayed for, are going to be harder for you to access. If they are accessible at all. I carried that story for years. I carried it into rooms and relationships and opportunities and let it make decisions for me that I did not fully realize it was making. I turned down things I wanted because the story said I did not deserve them. I stayed in situations that hurt me because the story said this was probably the best I could expect. I performed fineness so consistently and so thoroughly that I became genuinely uncertain about where the performance ended and the actual person began. I'm telling you this first because I want you to understand the full weight of what had accumulated by the time I finally decided to examine it. And I want you to understand that I did not arrive at that decision from a place of strength or clarity or readiness. I arrived at it from a place of pure exhaustion. I was tired of carrying something that heavy. I was tired of organizing my entire life around the management of a story that was making me smaller every year. I did not know yet how to put it down. I just knew that I could not keep picking it up every morning and pretending it was not crushing me. The moment that changed everything was not dramatic, and I think that is important to say clearly because I know we expect these moments to be dramatic. We expect them to arrive with weight and clarity, a conversation that cracks something open, a crisis that forces the truth into the light, a bottom that is unmistakable in its bottomness. My moment was a Tuesday evening in my apartment. I had canceled plans I had actually been looking forward to, not because I was sick or because something important had come up, because the anxiety had been loud that day, and somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, it had convinced me that going would be a mistake, that something would go wrong, that I would say the wrong thing or want to leave too early or be too much in some way I could not precisely name but felt certain about. So I stayed home. I sat on my couch in the quiet of an evening I had been genuinely excited about a week earlier, and I looked around at my apartment and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me by arriving without drama, is this it? Not as a rhetorical question, as a genuine one. Is this the life? The one where I talk myself out of things I want because the voice in my head has convinced me that wanting things leads to disappointment, and that the best way to manage disappointment is to preemptively remove the wanting. Is this actually how I intend to spend my life? The answer, when I let myself hear it honestly, was no. But no was only useful if I was willing to do something with it. I had said no to this life before, in smaller ways, in moments of temporary clarity that dissolved. When the anxiety got loud again, and the old story reasserted itself, what was different about this Tuesday was that I was willing, for the first time, to actually look at the mechanism, to stop managing the symptoms, and start asking about the source. I made a therapy appointment the following morning. I want to be direct about this, because I think there is still too much silence around it. I did not make that appointment because I had a breakdown, or because someone intervened, or because I had reached a point of crisis. That left me no choice. I made it because I finally understood that the work I needed to do was beyond what I could do alone, and that asking for help with that was not a confirmation of how broken I was, but an act of basic intelligence. The bravest thing I did in this entire story was not anything that came later, not the promotion or the relationship or the life I eventually built. The bravest thing was opening my phone on a Wednesday morning and making that appointment, and then actually showing up to it that following week even, though every anxious part of me spent 7 days generating reasons not to. Therapy was not what I expected, and I want to be honest about that too, because I think the version of therapy we see represented in film and television does a disservice to what the actual experience is like for most people. I expected insight. I expected that a professional would hear my history and identify the source of everything and hand me an explanation that would immediately reorder my understanding of myself in a way that felt like relief. What I got instead was work. Slow, uncomfortable, non-linear work that frequently made me feel worse before it made me feel better, and that required me to stay in the room with things I had spent years developing sophisticated strategies to avoid. My therapist was direct in a way I had not anticipated. She did not reflect my pain back to me with gentle affirmations. She asked questions that had edges on them. She pointed out patterns in the things I said that I had not noticed were patterns. She connected things from my past to things in my present in ways that were obvious in retrospect and completely invisible to me before she named them. She also, crucially, did not tell me what to think or feel about any of it. She just kept creating conditions in which I had to think and feel, which is a different thing entirely and considerably harder. There were sessions I left feeling genuinely lighter. There were sessions I left feeling like I had been turned inside out and hung up to dry, which was not pleasant in the moment, but was, I came to understand, the sessions where the most important work had happened. I went every week for the first year. I went every 2 weeks for the year after that. I still go occasionally now, not because I'm in crisis, but because I have come to understand maintenance as a form of respect for the work already done rather than an admission of ongoing failure. The changes did not happen all at once. They happened in the small daily accumulation of new responses to old triggers. I noticed them first in the quiet ways. The voice in my head that had always narrated my inadequacy started, gradually and almost imperceptibly, to lose some of its authority. Not its volume, not at first, but its authority. I could hear it saying the old things, and I could also, for the first time, hear something else underneath it, asking whether those things were actually true. That gap between the old story and the question of whether it was true was where everything that came after was built. It was not a wide gap at first. It was barely a crack, but I have learned that cracks are sufficient if you are willing to keep working at them, rather than filling them back in with the familiar material, because familiar is more comfortable than honest. I kept working. The crack got wider. The light that came through it changed everything. The first concrete change I made in my external life, as opposed to the internal work that was happening in therapy, was applying for a promotion. I had been eligible for 18 months and had been talking myself out of for all 18 of those months. The reasons I had given myself for not applying were elaborate and internally consistent. and almost entirely generated by the old story rather than by any actual assessment of my capabilities. I was not ready. The timing was not right. There were other candidates who were more suited. I needed another year of experience before I could justify the ask. I had cataloged my own disqualifications so thoroughly that I had managed to feel genuinely humble about not applying, as if I were making a considered professional judgment rather than acting out a belief that I was not allowed to want things. My therapist pointed this out in a session that I left feeling turned inside out. She said very simply, "You have been doing this job at the senior level for a year without the title or the pay. What exactly are you waiting for?" I did not have an answer that held up under examination. I applied the following week. The process was uncomfortable in the specific way that putting yourself forward for something you genuinely want is always uncomfortable, because the vulnerability of wanting is so much larger than the vulnerability of not caring. I prepared thoroughly. I walked into the interview as someone who had decided in advance that she deserved to be in the room, which is a decision you have to make before you get there, because the room itself will not make it for you. I got the promotion. I want to tell you how I felt when I found out, and I want to be honest about it, which means telling you that my first feeling was not triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated. It was the feeling of something that had been held wrongly for a long time being finally set down in its correct position, like a bone that had healed slightly wrong being reset, painful in the moment and immediately, undeniably more right than before. I called my therapist after I called my mother. That tells you something about where the real work had happened. I sat in my car in the parking garage and I said out loud to no one, I did it, not as a declaration, just as a fact that needed to be heard by at least one person, even if that person was only me. I drove home and I cooked a real meal and I sat at my table and ate it, and I let the evening be ordinary in the way that ordinary evenings feel extraordinary. When you are someone who has spent years convinced she was not allowed to have them. Paragraph 5. The relationship came later, about 2 years into the therapy work, and I want to tell you about it in a way that is honest rather than romantic, because I think the romantic version would actually undercut the point. I was not looking. That is true, and it matters, but not in the way it is usually meant when people say it. I was not doing the thing where you perform not looking as a strategy for finding. I was genuinely not looking, because for the first time in my adult life, I was not organized around the absence of a relationship. I had a life that felt full in ways that had nothing to do with whether someone was choosing me. I had work I found genuinely meaningful. I had friendships that had deepened in the years since I had started showing up to them more honestly. I had a relationship with my own interior. Life that no longer felt like a liability to be managed, but like a landscape I was genuinely interested in inhabiting. I was not waiting for someone to complete something. I was already whole in a way I had not been before and had not known was available to me. His name was Marcus, and we met through a friend at a dinner that I almost did not attend because I was tired from a long week, and my couch was offering a compelling alternative. I went anyway, which is a small fact that carries a large amount of weight in retrospect. He was quiet in a way that was not absence but attention. He listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke, it was worth having waited for. He asked me a question in the first hour of that dinner that nobody had ever asked me before. He asked what I found genuinely difficult and was working on, not as a therapy exercise or a test or an attempt at unusual depth for its own sake, just as a real question from someone who was genuinely curious about the honest answer. I told him the truth, not all of it, not that first night, but enough of it to be real. He did not flinch. He did not recalibrate his expression into something careful and managed. He just nodded and said something that acknowledged what I had said without making it either a bigger deal than it needed to be or a smaller deal than it was. I drove home that night thinking about that question and that answer, and the fact that telling the truth about something difficult had not resulted in the withdrawal I had been trained to expect. We went for coffee the following week, and then dinner the week after, and then somewhere in the natural accumulation of time spent. Honestly, together, we became something neither of us had needed to name before. The name was already true. I want to tell you about the moment I understood that I had actually changed, not in the abstract way of personal growth, narratives, but in a concrete and specific way that I can point to. It was about 8 months into the relationship with Marcus. We were having a disagreement, nothing dramatic, the ordinary friction of two people with different ways of thinking through a problem. And I noticed something happening in me that I recognized from years of practice, but had never before been able to interrupt in real time. The old story was activating. The voice was starting its familiar work. He is going to leave. You are too much. You are doing the thing that makes people leave. I heard it clearly. And then for the first time in my memory, I heard something else alongside it, equally clear and considerably more grounded. That is the old story. This is a disagreement. Those are not the same thing. I stayed in the conversation. I said what I actually thought instead of contracting into appeasement. We worked through it the way people who are actually in it together work through things. Not cleanly or quickly, but genuinely, with both people's reality on the table. Afterward, Marcus said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "I appreciate that you stayed in that. I know that is not always easy." He did not know the full history of why it was not easy. He just knew enough of me to recognize that something real had happened and to name it without making it bigger than it needed to be. I cried in the bathroom afterward, not from sadness, from the specific relief of something that has been braced against impact for a very long time finally being allowed to lower its guard. The broken thing was not broken. It had never been broken. It had been tender. And there is an enormous difference between tender and broken that I had been unable to see for years, because everyone who had tried to describe it to me had used the wrong word. Tender means it needs care. Broken means it cannot be fixed. I had been treating something that needed care as though it were something that could not be repaired. And in doing so, I had been withholding from myself the only thing that would actually have helped, which was the care itself. I am not going to tell you I am finished. I am not finished. I do not think this kind of work ever arrives at a finished. What I can tell you is that I am further from where I started than I once believed was possible, and that the distance I have traveled is the most valuable thing I own, more valuable than the promotion or the relationship or any of the external evidence of a life going well. The distance itself, the fact of having walked it, that is the thing nobody can take. Here's what I want to leave you with, and I need you to hear this as someone who is sitting exactly where you might be sitting right now, someone who had absorbed enough messages about her own difficulty that she had stopped questioning whether they were true and had simply begun organizing her life around them as though they were fixed facts about the universe. They are not fixed facts. They're stories, and stories, unlike facts, can be rewritten. Not quickly, not without effort, not without the willingness to sit in the discomfort of examining something you have been carrying for so long that it has started to feel like part of your body, rather than something external you picked up along the way. But they can be rewritten. I am the proof of that, and I am not special. I do not have access to something that you do not have access to. I made an appointment, and I showed up to it, and I kept showing up, and I did the work even when the work was hard, and I applied for the thing, and I went to the dinner, and I stayed in the disagreement, and I told the truth about what was difficult. And I lowered my guard when someone showed me it was safe to. And I kept choosing every single day to act like someone who deserved the life she was building, even before she fully believed it. That last part is important. You do not have to believe it yet. You just have to act like it while you are still working on the believing. The believing catches up. I promise you, it catches up. The voice that tells you that you are too broken, too much, too complicated, too damaged for the ordinary things other people have. That voice is not your truth. It is the accumulated sediment of other people's limitations deposited in you over years, and it does not belong to you. And you are allowed to give it back. You are allowed to stand up one day and say, this story is not mine and I am not carrying it anymore, and then actually put it down. It will feel impossible the first time you try. It will feel like you're dismantling something load-bearing, like everything will collapse without it. Nothing will collapse. You will be lighter. You will be able to move in ways you had forgotten were available to you. You will find, gradually, and then all at once, that the life you were convinced was not available to someone like you was simply waiting for you to stop agreeing with the people who told you that you could not have it. You are not too broken to be loved. You never were. You were just surrounded for a while by people who could not see you clearly. Find the ones who can. Become someone who can see yourself clearly. The rest of the story writes itself from there, and it is, I promise you, a far better story than the one you were told.